My name is Mickey Barker, and today is August 24, 2012, and I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee to interview Judge Herschel Franks. This interview is taking place as a part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Would you state your full name, please?
Herschel Pickens Franks.
And what was your date of birth and where were you born?
I was born in Hardin County, Tennessee, 12/28/30.
Now, the county seat of Hardin County is Savannah.
Savannah, correct.
So you were born close to Shiloh battlefield.
About 3 miles or 4 miles across the river from the battlefield.
Now, what were your parents' names and what did they do?
My father's name was Herschel Ralph Franks, and my mother's name was Beta Faye Pickens. She married a Franks. My mother taught school in the early years, and my father, he had great plans. He had bought a store building, he had bought a home with some acreage, and he'd also bought a 19 and 28 Dodge Roadster. The Depression hit, and he owed money.
Yeah.
He had to sell his store building, and he had to park his Roadster in our barn shed, and I played in it as a child. But then he did some farming early on, and then he first got in the grocery store business. He was very disappointed he didn't get in when he wanted to because of the Great Depression. During the war, he drove a peddling truck and delivered groceries and sold them around the county because people didn't have gas to go to the store. As soon as the war was over, he opened his own store, and he ran a store the rest of his life.
Were your grandparents natives of Hardin County too?
Yeah, oh yes.
This is a question that is interesting me. Would your ancestors have been residents of Hardin County at the time of the Battle of Shiloh?
Oh yes, yes.
Do you know whether any of your parents fought for either side, or grandparents?
The Franks all fought for the Union. Yeah. And I had a great-grandfather who was a Union officer from Hardin County. The interesting thing about the people who lived along the river over there, they were like East Tennesseans. They were all for the Union. And in modern times, those counties have voted Republican, even when Democrats were running the state. And it carried over. My Franks ancestors came to Tennessee in 1816. My first ancestor came from Germany in 1762 to South Carolina.
That'd be on the Frank side.
Frank side. He was a winemaker, so he migrates to North Carolina. And this would have been, I don't know exactly when he got to North Carolina, but the whole clan in 1816, and I don't know why, decided to move. By then, there were about 38 or 40 of them. They came overland to the Tennessee River. They got on rafts, came down the Tennessee River. One stopped off in Loudon and had a farm there. They came down to Chattanooga. One of them got involved with an Indian squaw, and a brave killed him here, Williams Island.
Here in Chattanooga.
The rest of them continued down the Tennessee River, and just as soon as they get inside of Tennessee again, they stopped in that hill, godforsaken hill country, and built their homes in about 18 and 17. At that point, Hardin County was the only county in West Tennessee. It extended across the rest of the state, and it was divided up later into other counties. But that's where they stopped and stayed.
It's always interested me that Savannah and Hardin County were primarily Unionist during the Civil War, and they were surrounded by folks who were Confederate leaning. Do you know what historically caused that? Were there not slave owners there in Hardin County, or do you know how that happened?
I don't really know. I've read that most of them came from Europe and Germany and Moravia and those areas, and they didn't like the European experience. They believed in a strong federal government, and that's one of the reasons they sided with the Union in this war. They certainly didn't have slaves. There wasn't any farmland there to speak of for them.
Do they vote mainly today Republican or Democrat, or is there
mainly Republican, and always have?
It's amazing.
Another little story about my ancestors. My great-grandfather that fought in the Civil War, he and another person formed a company of Union soldiers, and they were in the process, and the rebels came one night to his home and took him away. His wife thought they would kill him, but he somehow escaped, and the next day, he and his band of Union sympathizers marched toward, the Union Army had a place up around Nashville. They go up there and join the Union Army. Now, my great-grandmother lived, I said, about 3 miles across the river from Shiloh on high ground. Now, when they had the Battle of Shiloh, she thought he was in the battle. And the story handed down in the family is that all day it sounded like river cane being burned around a wash kettle, the popping sound. So, but he survived the war and came home and lived a normal life.
How old was your father when he died, and your mother? Did they have long lives?
My father was killed in an automobile accident. He probably would have had a long life. My mother lived to be 99.
Now, you were an only child.
I am.
As you were growing up, this is a hard question maybe, but can you tell us what your very first memory is? What's the first thing you remember?
We lived in the store building that my dad bought when I was a little boy before he sold it. Yeah. And there was an apartment in the back and a big grocery area up front and had a lot of glass in front. And I remember, I couldn't have been, between 2 and 3, I guess. Yeah. Someone said a drover is herding a herd of hogs down the road. I ran up to the front and looked out the window and saw a man driving some hogs on the country road. I think that's my first memory.
Now, you were growing up during the Depression. Did you realize at that time that you were poor, or were you poor, your family?
Well, we were pretty poor.
Did you know it?
But you know, everyone else was around me, so you know, you didn't think much about it. We were self-sustaining. We had cattle, we had hogs, we had chickens, we had big gardens, we had fruit, bees. So we essentially lived off the land for a few years during that Depression, but we survived.
So you lived on a farm rather than in town?
Right.
Now, where was the farm?
Well, it was, geographically, it was just kind of across the river from Shiloh on the east side of the river.
So how far was it from the farm to your elementary school, and how did you get to the elementary school?
My first 4 years, there was a small school near me. Then I was bused to Savannah for the rest of my schooling through high school.
So you were riding school buses during the Depression?
Yes, toward the end of it, if there was an end to it.
Do you remember the name of your first teacher in elementary school?
Yes.
And what was it?
Mrs. Roberts.
Did you like her?
Her husband was an undertaker.
Her husband was an undertaker.
She was a good teacher, too.
How many students would have been in your little school there? The first one you went to?
First 4 years?
Yes, sir.
School? Oh, well, they had 2 rooms. They were divided into 2 classes. I don't know, 40 or 50.
So you were in the classroom that held grades 1 through 3, and then there was another one for 4 through 6?
Something like that.
And how many people would have been in your particular class level?
Oh, 10 or 12.
Who were some of your best friends? You remember their names?
Probably not really.
Do you remember some of the things you would do after school for hobbies or fun? What were they?
Well, we'd have games and some ball, just sandlot ball, things like that.
And you said you were bused when you got out of the elementary school level, so that would have been through 7 through 12?
Yeah, or before, I guess 5 through 12 maybe.
And was it a separate junior high school, as we used to call them, or high school, or all?
No, there was elementary school at Savannah through the 8th grade, and then a high school
okay.
through the 9th through 12th grade.
So would that have been something like Hardin County High School?
Central High School.
Central High School. And what year did you graduate?
1948.
So you were not grown when World War II occurred?
No, I was 11, I guess, when it started.
Do you remember Pearl Harbor?
Oh, sure. We'd gone to church that morning, and we came home, and turned on the radio. That's the first time we heard it. We were having lunch. My daddy was visibly upset.
Yeah.
My grandfather lived not too far from us. He said after lunch, he said, "Let's go see my daddy." Well, they have a lot of serious talking that I wasn't privy to while we were there, but they were both impacted by the attack on Pearl Harbor, visibly.
Well, let's move fast forward a little bit. You've now graduated from high school. It's 1948, and I think the record is, or your biography is, that you went to UT Martin.
I did. It was a junior college, a two-year school at that point.
And did you stay in a dormitory?
I did.
Do you remember what I guess you wouldn't declare a major in junior college, would you, or did you?
Well, it's interesting. My principal said I should major in engineering. My father wanted me to take pre-medicine. My mother wanted me to become a preacher, so I was torn. I enrolled in pre-med program at Martin.
And that would have been from the fall of 1948 through what?
1950.
And then when you got out of UT Martin, what did you do?
Well, it's an interesting story. While I was at Martin, I joined the Tennessee National Guard, which was the old 30th Infantry Division in World War II.
Right.
We met once a month, I think, at night. I finished my second year at Martin, and I'd planned to go to UT Knoxville from there. Well, the Korean War broke out in June.
June 1950.
1950. My commanding officer of the National Guard said, "We're going to be activated on good authority, and I'm going to give all of you as much rank as I can before we go." Well, I didn't apply to Knoxville because I thought they were going to be activated. Well, the summer dragged on, and no word about activation. Myself and two of my college buddies decided we'd join the Air Force. So in December, we joined the U.S. Air Force. And the irony is that National Guard unit was never activated in the war. I could have finished college in the National Guard, but I don't regret what I did.
So you went on active duty in the Air Force in January 1951?
December 1951.
And
in 1950.
1950. And I guess they sent you for basic training to Lackland Air Force Base?
Went to Lackland, and Time magazine reports this. 60,000 college kids joined the Air Force in November and December of 1950. They had so many out there, they started stretching tents for them. We were one of the luckiest ones. We went up to Shepherd Air Force Base and had our basic training in North Texas, but it was really cold up there. Then they sent me to Keesler for electronics school, which lasted almost a year. Airborne electronics was a specialty.
Now, Keesler Air Force Base is in Montgomery.
Biloxi, Mississippi.
Biloxi, yes.
Then,
wait, what did you do there for a year? Trained you what?
In school, electronics school.
Oh.
And we got orders to go to Europe. And the story goes, the old man of the outfit said, "Where are we going to send these guys?" There were 50 of us in the class. He says, and it's the luck of the geography, I guess. He said, "Send all the class that lives west of the Mississippi River to Korea, those that live east of it to European theater." So we went to England, and we get over there, and they had too many people. This was the airborne electronics program. They had too many trained in that, so they put me in a ground radar school, which lasted almost another year. So half my time in the Air Force was going to school.
You had signed up for 4 years.
Yeah, I spent 4 years in the Air Force.
Did you learn anything in the service that's been useful to you in your civilian life in these years since?
Oh, I'm sure I have. I traveled a lot in Europe. That was a enlightening experience, and living in England too was in many ways broadening me, I think. But what I decided to do in the Air Force was to become a lawyer. I never did really want to become a doctor.
Had anybody in your family ever been a lawyer before?
No, or a doctor either.
Do you know how you decided you wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, it's interesting. I got interested in courts martial over there, and I saw how, well, how bad they could be and without good representation. And that encouraged me to study law. And I was looking for something to do other than what my family and the educators wanted me to do.
So you must have graduated from left the Air Force in about December of '54.
Correct.
And then when did you enter UT?
I entered.
Or did you?
I did. I didn't have enough hours to get into. I'd taken credit in University of Maryland had a resident campus where I was in England, so I took a lot of night college courses there and got credit for them, but I still needed a few hours to get in law school. So I came to UT and took the necessary hours, and I got in the fall of '55 to law school.
How'd you like law school?
Oh, it was very interesting. I enjoyed law school.
Never had any regrets?
No, none whatsoever.
Who were some of your favorite teachers at the UT College of Law back in the '50s?
Well, Colonel Warner, Horace Lacey, Elvin Overton was probably my most favorite professor. A lot of students didn't like him, but I really enjoyed his courses. He was an individualist and had a lot to say about everything. Colorful, I guess, is the word to use on him.
Which course or courses did you like the most?
That's difficult to say. I did dislike many of them. I guess real property was a favorite course, constitutional law and procedure. I said I didn't like. There wasn't many I didn't like.
When you got out of law school, I guess I'm just trying to put this together about when, 1958?
Yes.
And then how did you decide to come to Chattanooga?
Well, I decided in law school to be a solo practitioner in a mid-sized town like Athens or Columbia, or I didn't want to go back to Savannah. It wasn't quite as big as I thought it should be for lawyers. And I looked around the state. Well, in the interim, I took a job with USF&G Claims Department in Knoxville to have something to do till I decided where I was going. And nothing ever clicked, but a lot of my classmates came to Chattanooga and they said, lawyers in demand in Chattanooga, come down and interview. So when I hadn't really hit on anything where I wanted to go, I came down here and interviewed and ended up with joining the firm I did.
What was the name of that firm?
It was in Moon, Harris, and Deneen, and Campbell Hardin, who was associate in that firm, ran against Ralston Schofield for the criminal court judge and beat Schofield. So they had an opening for an associate, and I took his place in that firm.
Was Johnny Deneen still practicing when you got there?
He was.
We won't get into stories about him, but he was colorful, wasn't he?
He really was. I'll tell you one. He was a bachelor Catholic, and he was an old guy then. And Joe Murphy was the town drunk that was a Catholic too, both good Irishmen. And he said he met Murphy on the street one day about noon and on 8th Street, and Murphy said, "John, don't go for confessions today. They're only hearing murders and rapes." Well, John loved to tell that story.
Did John ever tell you about the time in 1940 or 41 when he and Buck Dietzen got thrown out of Bing Crosby's house?
He did.
We won't go into that. That's someone else's. So what did they assign you to do when you signed up with this law firm? Was it insurance defense?
Mostly insurance defense. We represented the Hamilton Bank and title company and basically corporate work. I did a few plaintiffs' cases, but it's more pro bono than anything.
Do you recall what your starting salary was?
$7,500 a year plus half of any fees I brought to the firm, which were not many for a year or two.
Well, that was a pretty good salary for back then. And you stayed with that firm your entire career as a practitioner?
About 11 years.
Now, you and I met in 1962, so you'd been in Chattanooga about 3 or 4 years.
About 3 years, I guess.
And we met when both of us were involved in the committee to help Frank Clement in one of his runs for governor.
That's right.
And he was a Democrat.
He was.
Now, you're a Democrat.
Well,
But you started out in the Republican.
I grew up as a Republican, and I was head of Eisenhower's re-election effort in 1956 as a law school representative for Eisenhower. We in the Air Force like Ike, as you can imagine. He said in his campaign he would put an end to this Korean War. I think every man in my outfit voted absentee for Eisenhower from England. I thought he'd been a good president too. He warned us about some bad things that have happened to us, like the military-industrial complex. But I came to Chattanooga, and the Democrats were in charge here, and I was interested in politics, and so I got involved with Clement. He was the first Democrat I got involved with and supported. And
Me too.
basically, I more or less remained a Democrat. I'm disenchanted with both parties now, and somebody asked me, I'd probably say I'm an independent thinker, hopefully.
What were some of the things you got involved with in Chattanooga as a newcomer outside of the practice of law and outside of politics?
Well, being a newcomer, I joined a lot of organizations. I joined Chamber of Commerce, Big Brothers, worked very active in the Bar Association for 5 years on the Board of Governors, served as president of the bar and other things, and just a junior achievement, I don't know. I just got involved in a lot of activities here and enjoyed it and meeting people.
Now, you said that you did some title work and did some work for Hamilton Bank. Did you do any trial work?
Yes, I defended insurance defense cases, mostly my trial work, and I did a lot of pro bono criminal work.
Tell us about a couple of the cases that you heard, that you participated in that stand out, either serious or funny or both.
Gosh, that's been a long time ago.
You've got a million of them.
Well, I guess I remember more things that happened when I was a chancellor than I do in the practice of law. I represented a woman in her divorce case, mainly pro bono, and I got her divorce. And a couple of years later, she came back, said, I need to get a divorce, and I started getting the information, and she had married the same guy again. Mm-hmm. So I got her another divorce, and I said, if you marry this guy again, find you another lawyer. I won't represent you a third time.
You said you did some pro bono criminal cases. How were criminal assignments made back in those days?
You get on the list of the criminal judges. You tell them you'd like to take some pro bono cases, and also in federal court as well.
And you say pro bono, you weren't paid for any of those?
Not paid. In federal court, you were paid a little, but nothing in the state court. Yeah. But it was a change of pace, and I enjoyed it. Pro bono, I represented this guy that the police hadn't given him his Miranda warnings. The Supreme Court hadn't passed Miranda, but the federal system was holding that. I tried to get it dismissed on that ground, or not, and they didn't do it. They tried him and convicted him. I appealed it to the Supreme Court, and Ross Dyer was the Chief Justice, and he jumped all over me. He said, that's not the law of Tennessee, and you're in effect wasting your time, Mr. Franks. And I said, well, it ought to be. And he visibly blushed. He was angry with me. But I learned something there, I think, about life and the law. The guy served 3 years in prison, and I'd talked to him about it and how the law, I thought, was going where he would have been protected from not getting his Miranda warning and talking to the cops. He gets out of prison. I picked up the paper one morning, and the paper said he had shot and killed a man in a bar on 9th Street, now MLK. I go to the jail to see him. And I said, what in the world did you do that for? He said, I really don't know. I didn't know the man. I was so angry at the world, and I'd got somebody giving me a gun, and I just lashed out without any rational reason. And I factored in my own mind that he thought he had been railroaded in the courts, and it affected his behavior when he got out of prison. I may be wrong about that, but that's the way I assessed the situation.
You know, today is August 24, 2012, and we've just heard today on the news about a man in New York City in front of the Empire State Building shooting people, and others were wounded. And then a week or two ago, we heard of a young man out in Colorado who shot and killed over 12 or 13 people in a movie theater. Do you have an opinion about the proliferation of firearms today and the Second Amendment?
Well, we have the Second Amendment, and people are entitled to have the rights that are afforded under that, but we just have too many guns in this society. They're too easy to obtain, and I can see no reason why we need an automatic weapon with 100 rounds. You can fire in a minute and a half. We need more regulation. We're entitled to have our guns, but we need more regulation on who gets them and what kind of guns they get. I feel strongly about that.
Let's change the subject again to something a little lighter. Chattanooga was known to have a lot of colorful lawyers. You and I both have known a lot. Tell us about a couple that stand out in your mind as really being colorful.
Maurice Weaver and the late Gus Wood Sr.
That didn't take you but a second. Why do you select those two just immediately?
Well,
what was there about Maurice Weaver that was colorful?
He was an intelligent fellow, but he dissipated his life, but he was just a very colorful lawyer, I thought, in court and out of court. He represented this. I wasn't involved in the case, but I don't know whether it was in the courtroom or not, but I know all about it. This tractor trailer lost control going down the road to Saudi Daisy and ran over this woman's car, and she just had some serious injuries. He took the position that it tipped her over the top emotionally, and she never came to testify, but she had a shrink that said she was out of it. She didn't testify in court. He put on his case. It was a jury case. And he gets up to argue. He said, "For my client, the sun no longer rises and the birds no longer sing." He got a good judgment for her without her appearing in court. He had some talent. And
How about Gus Wood?
Oh, first case I ever tried to settle with Gus, I just met him a few days before. He was in the same building I was. I go up to see him. I said, it was a case of liability. I said, "Mr. Wood, I'd like to try to work out a settlement with you on this case." He reaches in his drawer, pulls out a snub-nose 38 and slams it down on the desk. He said, "Son, now we'll negotiate."
that helped form your opinion on gun control?
No, I knew what he was doing.
Did you
I don't
settle
know,
the
there's
case?
a lot of colorful lawyers back then. It's more of a business now, and you have to really work hard to have a good income, and you don't have time for all this fun, I guess, like we used to.
And of course, you've been a judge now since 1970, so this may be an unfair question, but is the practice of law today as fun as it used to be
Well,
when you began?
I don't think so. I'm not practiced law in so long, I'm not sure, but no, I don't think so. I think billable hours and high cost of overhead, all of the above it's a different practice than it was when I practiced.
You know, I went on the bench in 1983, and you had already gone to the Court of Appeals by then, but you recall back in those days, a lot of lawsuits were tried, sometimes 3 or 4 jury trials a week. And
yes.
Now there are not many cases being tried. What's your view of alternative dispute resolution versus a trial?
Well, I guess it's a choice of the parties, and it sure keeps a lot of cases out of court. And maybe less expense involved. I've not practiced law under those conditions, but I know there are a lot fewer cases in the trial court and on appeal.
So the docket you today have is not as great as it was, say, 10 years ago?
It's not. After I got on the Court of Appeals, the docket grew every year, not hugely, but it kept increasing the volume of appeals. It leveled off between probably 1996 and 2000, and it kind of stabilized there. And just before this downturn, the number of appeals plummeted, and then we have about 30% less appeals now than we had 10 years ago.
Now, I don't mean to speak about your age, but you went on the bench in 1970 as a chancellor, and it's now 2012. If I'm correct, that's 42 years.
Yes.
Do you know of anyone in the state's history that served on the bench longer than you? Perhaps Grafton Green and perhaps Tip Taylor?
Neither one of them did. I looked them up.
So how long? So you're the
Presently, I'm the
judge?
longest serving judge in Tennessee right now, but I don't know whether that holds up historically or not. But I know Green came on in 1910, and he went off in 48. So he was there 38 years.
And you've got him
And
beat
Tip
by 4.
Taylor, I don't remember. Tip was a circuit judge in my circuit when I graduated from high school, but I think he was there 30-something years total.
Is it still fun? You still like it?
I do like it, but I'm thinking of retiring anytime.
If you do retire, what would be your plans? What would occupy your time?
The law would not. Anything else that would be fun, I'd try to pursue.
Now, your wife is an attorney,
She is.
and she was a member. She was a staff attorney for the Supreme Court.
She went to law school after her children got grown or up at school. She went to UT Law School. She graduated from Rhodes in Memphis. And she got through law school and she clerked for my late good friend John Byers, who we were classmates in law school. She clerked for him 2 or 3 years.
And her name, to make sure we get this on
Judy. She was Judy Wood.
Yeah.
She was married to Black, the professor at UT, for many years, but then they divorced. Then she clerked for Justice Travoto when he was Chief Justice in Nashville, and then she was staff attorney for the Tennessee Supreme Court for a few years. And then we got married, and she moved to Chattanooga with me, and she did a little practice, but not much.
Who introduced you to? Who introduced you to?
Well, I guess John did. She was working for, I was already on the court, but she came to work for John as a clerk.
Now, when you go home after work, do you discuss any of your lawsuits with her and
Not
ask
really.
her opinions about some of them?
No, we talk about law that we see in the newspapers and on television, but we don't talk much about my cases.
Now, you have one daughter. That's Ramona.
Ramona.
Tell us a little about Ramona. Who's she married to, and what's her married name, and where do they live?
Ramona married Jason Hagmeyer. He's an attorney in Mobile, Alabama, practices law. She was going to medicine, but for some reason she turned her off. She went to WNL, Phi Beta Kappa, her junior year. She could have gotten in medical school without any trouble, but for some reason she didn't want to go. She gets married and has a wonderful daughter who's be 13 her birthday.
And her name is?
Megan.
Megan.
And my daughter Ramona then went to physician assistant school down there, and she's practicing with a clinic in Mobile.
And you go down to Mobile quite often, I understand, to see your granddaughter.
Well, not as often as I'd like to. Yeah.
What hobbies do you have now?
Hobbies, reading, gardening, and things like that. No sports, unless you call gardening a sport.
Do you ever get tired of that drive back and forth from Chattanooga to Knoxville to hold court, staying at the Hilton Hotel?
Well, that's my home away from home. They all know me there by name for years.
What you say you like to read? What are some of the things you're currently reading?
Well, I read more newspapers and magazines than anything. I read a few novels along, but not many. I used to read a lot of those, but I don't anymore.
I don't think it's any secret that your best friend on the court was Judge Houston Goddard.
Great friends for over a quarter of a century. I was a so-called Democrat, and he was a real Republican, but that never stood in the way of our friendship.
We asked Judge Goddard one time, had he ever voted for a Democrat, and tell us what his answer was.
He used that answer over and over. He said, I don't think so, but if I did, it was in a Sunday school class election. But he thinks I set him up one time, but I didn't. He came down here and went to lunch with me, and we were in the state office building, and the state office building manager was a Polk County Democrat, and they're incorrigible if you want to use some word about them. We were going out to lunch, and the lobby was full of people, and I saw the manager, and I said, "Benny, come over here. I want you to meet Judge Goddard." And I introduced him, and I said, trying to just make it small talk, I said, "Judge Goddard says he doesn't think he's ever voted for a Democrat unless it was a Sunday school class election." Well, this old Polk County Democrat made eye contact with Judge Goddard and said, "I voted for a lot of Republicans. I voted to send them to prison and sit there as a juror." Houston said, "Let's go to lunch." He thought I set him up, but I didn't. I had no idea that would come out.
Let's go back to your years in the Chancery Court. You went on the Chancery Court in 1970.
Yes.
And how was the vacancy created that got you there?
Chancellor Finkelstein had been a chancellor a long time, and for whatever reason, he knew I'd like to be a judge, and he was interested in my getting the appointment. So he told me when he was going to retire before he told anyone else. Well, to get my ducks in order, I decided to contact all of the Governor Ellington's supporters here, and I went to see Mayor Chunk Bender, who had been his manager, and I told the mayor, I said, "Chancellor Finkelstein's going to..."
Chunk Bender was the mayor of Chattanooga.
Mayor of Chattanooga. And I told him that I was interested in that job, and Chancellor Finkelstein had told me privately when he planned to retire, and I said, "I'd like your support and all the Ellington people's support over here if I can get it." And he said, "Well, Herschel, I'll recommend you and I'll support you." But he said, this would have been in June. The legislature hadn't adjourned, or maybe May. He said, "Don't tell anybody, especially people in the legislature. Some of those guys would trade on their own mother." So I didn't tell anybody, and it worked out for me.
What made you decide you wanted to quit practicing law and become a judge? Anything special that...
I think a lot of lawyers feel like that at some point of their career. Working in the Bar Association, we had some judges that I didn't think, and most of us didn't think measured up. We were always griping about how lawyers were treated in court, and I thought, if I could get to be a judge, I don't think I'd treat the lawyers like that. So that's part of my motivation, but I also just had a desire to change courses and become a judge at some point in my practice. Not that I didn't like the practice.
And did you decide on Chancery Court because you liked it better than Circuit Court, or because there was a vacancy there?
I liked it better than Circuit Court. I was asked, and I don't know that I've gotten it, I was asked if I was interested in Bob Summitt's job when he got to be appointed circuit judge, and I said no, I wasn't interested. That was 2 years before I got on the court.
Do you recall what the beginning salary was, or the salary was at the time you began as a chancellor in 1970?
Yeah, I took some cut and pay. 17.5, I believe. 15 or 17.5. But one thing that bridged the gap, I had a lot of cases that I worked on, and for about 2 years, I got fees out of the firm for the cases I'd had some time in on when I was practicing.
I'm not trying to butter you up, but you've got a lot of friends around town, lawyer friends. You're known as an instigator and fun-loving. What about your relationship with lawyers changed, if anything, when you became a chancellor?
Well,
did anybody treat you differently?
Well, some of them did. Obviously, they were more referential, I guess. I don't know. One lawyer, first Christmas I was there, came in and set a pint of whiskey on my desk in chambers and said, "Merry Christmas, Herschel." I said, "I can't take that." He said, "I don't know why not, it's Christmas." I said, "You never offered me any whiskey when we were lawyers together." He picked up his whiskey and left.
Good answer. I remember those days when at Christmas time all the lawyers would go to the courthouse and give all the clerks gifts. You remember those days?
I was a junior man in my firm, and I had to do that. And when I got to be a chancellor, I put down an order saying lawyers will not give our clerks. They didn't like that, but it stopped it.
I think what stopped it in the Chancery, the Circuit Court, was when the law firm in town, which will remain unnamed, wound up giving the Circuit Court Clerk's Office a big stereo system. And that got it stopped.
My firm represented Miller Brothers department store across the street, so we bought all the lady Paris silk hose, and they could take them back and change for the right size later. And I always had to take those gifts up there at Christmas time. And it just wasn't my philosophy to give the clerks or the judges any gifts in return for any favors you might expect.
Now, did you put down an order to stop that, or just
I did
announce
after I became a
policy?
chancellor. And Ray Brock went along with it, too.
And
in Chancery Court, it didn't apply to any other court.
so when you went to the bench, we had two chancellors, and Judge Ray Brock was the other chancellor.
He was.
And then later in 1974, he was elected to the Supreme
Court, and Wilkes Thrasher became the other chancellor then.
And how long were you on the bench as a chancellor?
8 years.
And when you got on the bench, you said you were appointed by Governor Ellington. There wasn't anything at that time called the selection commission or nominating commission. The governor just selected the person.
There's an interesting story about that. The bar, had referendums on anybody. Nobody put their name in for that job but me at the local bar association, so I consequently got whatever votes were cast. Joe Henry, who later was on the Supreme Court, was the president of the Tennessee Bar Association that year. And the newspaper published that my name had gone to Governor Ellington, and Joe picked up on it. He calls a press conference and says, I don't know whether Mr. Franks will get this appointment or not. I have a solemn commitment out of Governor Ellington that he will pick from 3 names submitted by the Bar Association, wherever they are, and says, they've only submitted 1 name. Well, when you think you've got the skids greased, that upsets you no end. So I make a beeline to see Mayor Bender, who was my point man with the governor. That morning I said, what do you think this has done to us? He said, nothing at all. Said, Governor Ellington's already called me and said, and he used a profanity. He said, send me 2 more names, which the bar sent him 2 more names without any more referendum, and it worked out.
What do you think of the current system for selecting trial judges when a vacancy occurs? That is the nominating commission.
Well, it screens them, and I think it's a good thing. They could weed out some that they wouldn't think would do a good job. I think it's an improvement over the governor just naming somebody in the past without any vetting.
What were some of the toughest cases you ever heard as a chancellor? Because you were deciding most of those without a jury. Can you think of anything that was really difficult?
Well, the one that got the most publicity was a woman on a respirator. She was a woman from Etowah, Tennessee. She had a heart attack. They were bringing her to Erlanger in an ambulance, and her heart stopped when they got to about Central Avenue. The time they got her in the emergency room, it had been stopped 10 or 15 minutes. They resuscitated her and got her heart beating, but she was essentially brain dead. The treating physician, according to her husband and family, told her he would turn off the respirator if they could get a court order authorizing him to. So their lawyer came and filed a petition in the court, and they so testified, ex parte, of course. So I set the case for an expedited hearing. The Tennessee Medical Society gets involved in it, and he changed his position. They fought it teeth and nail. We had a 3-day trial, and Carrie Ann Quinlan case had been decided, but there had been no other cases in the country decided. They left her alive. Case went on 3 days, and I ruled that she was essentially brain dead. I said, when the doctors conclude she's brain dead and there's no hope of change, the family can order them to turn her off. Well, they appealed it, but she died before the appeal was finished, and it became moot. But it was a tough case to decide, and I had a lot of coverage on it. It went all over the world, and there's several reporters there around every day. But I got some interesting feedback. I got a letter from a nun in Italy saying, "I'm praying that God has mercy on your soul, Judge." I got a letter from a guy in Denver, Colorado. Said, "I hope the Chattanooga police pulls your plug someday." And he signed it, a member of the American Nazi Party.
Oh.
I'm glad he lived in Colorado. But what was so reassuring, I got 2 or 3 letters from local physicians after the decision saying that we go along with the family all the time without getting involved in court, and complimented me on my decision. So those were good letters I got. The rest of them were threatening.
Did you ever consider not reading those kinds of letters?
Well,
did you ever respond to any of them?
No.
You know, that was one of the issues that we were faced with from time to time as judges. When we have difficult cases, we'll get calls from the press, the reporters, and they're trying to do their job and they're wanting comments, and it's difficult to not comment. Did you ever have any problems along those lines?
I had a pretty good relationship with the local newspaper report, both Times and the Free Press, and I told them, I said, "I'll talk to you about the procedures of the case. I won't talk to you about the merits, but I want you to tell me if I'm on the record or not before you start talking to me." And they honored that. If they came in and said you're on the record on the questions they asked, it worked okay. I didn't comment on the merits of the cases before with them. But it was an interesting story. Warren Herring was Free Press reporter, and I told him one time, I said, if you're going to publish a story critical of the Chancery Courts, I'd like for you to talk to me before you do and tell my side of it. He said he would. When Ray Brock was running for the Supreme Court, Ray got Leroy Phillips to sit for him, and Leroy had run for judgeship, and the Free Press had scalded him about being a pinko or something, you know. So this party was having a case before Leroy, and Brock was out on the campaign trail. And the Free Press had another reporter up there. Warren was in Gatlinburg on a break. And this guy gets up and says, "I don't want this communist trying my case," and his lawyer made a motion to recuse. Leroy wouldn't recuse. The reporter goes back to the editor, Lee Anderson, and says, tells him what had happened, and Lee said, "Do the story." So but the reporter called Warren and told him what he's about to do. Warren said, "Don't go with it today. I'll be back, because I promised Chancellor Franks that I would talk to him before we ran a critical story of the court, the Chancery Court." So he came back, and I told him, I said, Ray was still out of town. I said, "There won't be any more special judges." And he killed the story. And he didn't appoint any more special judges. I told Ray what had happened, and he agreed that he wouldn't have any more special judges. So that saved some criticism of the court, I guess. But I respected Warren. He was a man of his word.
Do you know of any reporters today who are not willing to honor their commitments?
Not personally, but I think from what I read, there's some that won't.
Do you have any cases that generate a lot of publicity in the Court of Appeals as much as perhaps they did in the trial court?
No. Seemed like I was in the paper every week as a chancellor for something.
What do you think of the difference between being a trial judge and being an appellate judge? I know I had a point of view about that. What's yours?
My point of view is that, one you're in the trenches and one you're in the attic, so to speak. And I think it works well. The trial judge he's on the firing line, and he gets to see the people, make the decisions, and I have a great I have more respect for trial judges since I was one. I've probably never been one, and we at the appellate level we don't have to rule immediately. We can think about it and consult with each other, and it's just a different type of work in a way, different approach to the law.
I've heard some folks say that someone should not be on the appellate bench unless they first served as a trial judge. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it can be helpful for insights if you've been a trial judge, but no, some very, very able lawyers were never judges were never a trial judge.
Well, you've got 3 colleagues on the Eastern section of the Court of Appeals now, none of whom have ever been a trial judge, and I think they're all doing a great job.
They do a good job.
Who's the best judge you ever knew, if you don't mind saying, trial or appellate here in Tennessee? And I won't ask you who the worst one was.
By reputation, I guess Luke McCamus.
Tell me about Luke McCamus.
Luke, we had, and I can't think of the guy's name from Chattanooga. The Court of Appeals was organized in 1925, and the first court had 3 judges in each section, I guess. I can't remember the judge's name from Chattanooga that was an alcoholic and didn't keep up his work. So Luke was a young lawyer from Kingsport and ran against him and defeated him. And he more or less wrote the tort law in Tennessee and other law. He wrote excellent opinions and was a nice man. And I was fortunate to know him in his last years. I had a lot of respect for him. I sat with him a few times after he'd retired on the Court of Appeals, but he was one of Tennessee's great judges, I think, and I suppose Grafton Green was, but that's all history. We've been blessed with a lot of good appellate judges and trial judges.
Well, I think now would be a good time for us to take a little break from our discussion. Well, we're now back from our break. Let's see, you went on the trial bench in 1970.
Correct.
And you left and went to the Court of Appeals in 1978.
Correct.
Now, I want you to tell the people who are watching this why you got put under an injunction, by whom, and is it still effective?
Well, it takes a little while to tell it. The newly elected Tennessee Supreme Court in 1974, and they were all my friends that got elected, and I knew them all well. They were sued by a group of lawyers in Chattanooga when they put down, I forget the name of the rule, without taking it through the legislature to get for approval, creating a Professional Standards Commission and charging fees to lawyers to fund it. The 5 lawyers in Chattanooga brought suit against the individual members of the Tennessee Supreme Court, seeking a declaratory judgment that the way they handled it was improper and it should be set aside because it in effect was a tax and it needed to be approved with the legislature. Well, they were sued in my court in Chattanooga, unfortunately, and I thought, gosh, this is an unusual situation to have the members of the Supreme Court defendants in your court. And someone from the Attorney General came by my office on another matter and said, we're already working on this case. We think it's a very interesting case. And I said, oh, I look forward to seeing you. And before that time to answer, the Supreme Court put down an order ordering me to dismiss the case and send them the record. Well, I was just stunned. I never dreamed that was going to happen. I was here. I took a recess and walked around the street trying to calm down. I came back and heard the case that day, and I took the record home with me that night. And I said, looked at the Constitution, looked at the case, and the Constitution says the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is appellate only. So I put down an order saying, in response to that, saying, in a nice way, you guys don't have jurisdiction to do this because the Constitution limits you to appellate jurisdiction. And I'm not going to dismiss the case, but I will send you the record because you ordered me to send you the record, and I think you're entitled to that. Well, they ordered the lawyers to argue the case before them, and they, of course, denied the request to void it. And in the process, when they wrote the opinion, they put out an injunction against the parties proceeding in that case or any other case, and as well as, and the chancellor was enjoined from entertaining the case any further. So that's, and it's been that way ever since. In a way, I thought it was a moral victory. I never dismissed the case, and it's still on the record in the courthouse in Chattanooga. But
you said it had to do with a rule. I think that was Rule 42 that later became the Board of Professional Responsibility.
Right. I think that's right.
Yeah.
And that's the history of that.
And the case is still pending?
Well, it's still on the docket. I never dismissed it.
Did you have any discussion later with any of your friends who were on the Supreme Court about that?
No, I never talked to them about that. I had a lot of lawyers. In fact, the Chattanooga Bar Association passed a resolution supporting me and really upset Justice Fones that the bar would get involved, but they were entitled to express their resolution. And the best, and I can't remember the guy's name, he was kind of a plaintiff's lawyer in Nashville, and he wrote a little book about the case. He was Vanderbilt Law graduated. He washed dishes through law school, but he was very laudatory of me in his little book, and I still have a copy of it.
You can't recall the name of the case now, the style of the case, can you?
I think I can. It was Al Barger and others versus members of the Tennessee Supreme Court. Tom Harris represented them represented the plaintiffs in that case. Speaking
of the Supreme Court, before we began today, you told us this interesting story about what occurred when you were in law school and the civil rights demonstrations that were occurring up in Clinton, Tennessee. If you don't mind, repeat that story. That was a good one.
Well, when I was in law school, they had ordered school integration in the 50s in Tennessee, and this outside agitators came down to Clinton. They were ordering the high school integrated. Someone in the nighttime bombed and destroyed the school, blew up Clinton High School. Well, Governor Clement called out the National Guard, and Joe Henry was the adjutant general. And I didn't see it, but the story goes that he came down the streets of Clinton in a tank standing in the turret with Pearl Handle 6 guns on his hips with an Eisenhower jacket on. But anyway, to make a long story short, they indicted a fellow named Casper from New Jersey as being the ringleader of the plot to blow up the school. And he was being tried in federal court there in Knoxville while I was in law school. And one year I was chairman of a committee to get speakers for our law fraternity. We'd have a luncheon meeting and a speech once or twice a month. So I go down to the federal building, and at noon recess, I asked him if he'd come out and speak to us.
Now, who's that?
Casper, the defendant.
Casper, okay.
I guess his lawyer wouldn't have wanted him to, but he agreed to. And he came, and we had, before he came, the word got out, and the dean and a couple more, the dean issued a press release that they didn't approve of this, and they wished it hadn't have happened, but they couldn't stop it or something. And anyway, he came, and we had the biggest crowd we'd ever had at our law fraternity, and several professors came. And of course, he was scurrilous, but and my defense was, if you can't hear both sides of the issue, you can't be a lawyer. Well, I had no brief for him, but I just thought it was part of history, and I didn't apologize for having him as our speaker.
But when you went to ask him, he wasn't in jail then?
No, he wasn't in jail.
And for those who might not know who we're talking about, when you mentioned Joe Henry as adjutant general, tell us who Joe Henry was then and what he became later.
He was a good trial lawyer, obviously, and he became He got on the Supreme Court in 1974 when the great Supreme Court got elected. They ran as a team, a Democrat team.
Wow.
And he served until he died with a heart attack. He didn't serve too long. And then Justice DeWoda took his place on the Supreme Court.
And that was in the summer of 1980.
Or was it? Yeah, I guess it was. Or 82. No, it's 80, I guess.
Well, oh me, I thought I'd turn this off. I had turned it off. I apologize. I don't know who that is. Can we edit that out? Let's go back, if we can, to the appellate courts. You've told us how you were appointed by Governor Ellington to the Chancery Court. What was the process like when the vacancy became available or came open on the Court of Appeals?
Well, the first time it came up was when Robert Cooper was elected to the Supreme Court. He was on the Eastern Section of the Court of Appeals in
1974.
74, and I applied for that vacancy. We had the nominating commission then, and Judge Goddard and I, and I forget the third, Chancellor Knoxville, who's deceased now, and I can't think of it. The three of us went to the governor, and Houston got the appointment. Governor Dunn appointed Judge Goddard to the bench. And then in 78, the legislature created 3 more Court of Appeals judges, 1 in each section. So I applied for that. Interesting story about that. I just had this case with the Tennessee Supreme Court we were talking about earlier, and in the private meeting with the commission, Mr. Bruce Foster Sr. was the chairman then, and he was the chairman when Houston and I applied in 74. And some lawyer from Nashville was asking me about that Supreme Court case, and I was giving my explanation for that. And Mr. Foster was sitting across the table from me, right across from me, and I could tell he was restless. And I was thinking as I explained to him, I said, I must be saying something that doesn't sit well with Mr. Foster. So I get through my explanation with that lawyer, a question about that Supreme Court case. I said, do you have any questions, Mr. Foster? Not about that. He said, they're saying from one end of the state to the other that Ray Blanton's going to appoint you to the Court of Appeals no matter what we do. I said, Mr. Foster, I haven't talked to the governor, which I hadn't. And that kind of mollified him a little. I did get the appointment, though.
Now, you were born in Savannah, and
Right.
Governor Blanton was from Adamsville,
Right.
which was about 20 miles away.
And we were fellow students at Martin Junior College.
So you had known him for a number of years.
Well, he got elected to the Congress, and I didn't keep up with him. But of course, I was in East Tennessee. But there's a little interesting aside there that Dayton Phillips, who was the chancellor, is a great storyteller. When I got I got one of the 3 nominees that went to the governor. One was Bill Inman, a fellow named Bernard Cantor from Kingsport or Johnson City, and myself.
Yeah.
Chancellor Phillips told me the story. He said Bernard Cantor came to see him. And the word had gotten out that Blanton and I had been roommates in college, which was a falsehood. I hardly knew Ray. I knew him, but we weren't chums or anything at Martin. But they said Franks and Ray Blanton were roommates in college. Ray was not too popular even then with the public. So Cantor goes in, according to Phillips, and says, they say Chancellor Franks was a roommate of Ray Blanton in college. Do you think I've got a chance for this appointment? That was the preface of his question. Dayton said, I responded, said, frankly, no. Well, Dayton had served 2 terms in Congress when Carroll Reese was a Republican chairman. He said, if I'd have been a golf-playing buddy of Dwight Eisenhower, I'd be on the United States Supreme Court instead of this lowly chancellor's job. He added, he said, Bernard went away sorrowful.
Chancellor Phillips was quite a character and colorful too, wasn't he?
He really was. Great storyteller, too.
So you did get the appointment.
I got the appointment.
And
yeah.
you took the oath of office, and when, do you remember the day?
It was in Nashville.
I mean, you remember the date?
sometime in May, I believe.
And how did you begin your tenure on the Court of Appeals? I mean, did you?
Well, Judge Schreiber, they weren't having a docket for about 6 weeks in Knoxville, so he asked me to come and sit in Nashville with them, which I did. My first docket was in Nashville.
And then you went to Knoxville.
Yes.
How were opinions assigned when you first got there? It was a three-member panel. Who would assign the opinions?
They would, the presiding judge would just take them in order, one, two, three, four.
And the presiding judge, when you went, was
James Parrott.
Judge Parrott. He was another colorful character.
He really was.
I think you were telling me during the break an interesting story about an opinion that had to be issued quickly. Tell that if you don't mind again.
I don't mind. We had this young girl who was 11 or 12 years old. She had terminal cancer. That was her diagnosis. The doctors thought they could maybe arrest it or delay it, and her father was an uneducated country preacher, and he refused to let her have medical treatment. He wanted God, I guess, to take care of her. Anyway, he didn't want her to have medical treatment. So the state stepped in, and the trial court ordered him to treat her. Well, he appealed it to our court. And of course, it was a hurry-up appeal. And we set it in less than 2 weeks after they got the record up there. So I told my law clerk, I said, and Judge Sanders and Judge Parrott and I were on the panel. I told my law clerk, I said, let's start working on this. We need to get opinion out as soon as we can. So he and I in the interim rough drafted an opinion, and
that's you and your law clerk.
Me and my law clerk. So we get up there for court that morning, and I told Judge Parrott, I said, we've got a rough draft and an opinion. After we hear arguments, we can revise it as much as we need and put it together and give them a decision today. The doctors had testified every day that went by there'd be less of a chance of her stabilizing it. So we heard the arguments, and Judge Parrott said we'll come back at 1:30 and announce our decision. And national media was there, as you can imagine, a lot of other people. I told Judge Parrott, I said, my law clerk and I worked on this, but let's just do this per curiam. He said, fine. So we put the finishing touches on it, and I gave him the opinion per curiam. He opens court, and he said, we're pleased that we could give you a decision this promptly. You know, I burned the midnight oil last night getting this opinion ready. I was angry and annoyed with him at the time, but I later thought, well, I left myself open and he took advantage of it.
Now, you're now the presiding judge.
Yes.
For not only the eastern section, but the entire Court of Appeals.
Yes.
Is that based on seniority?
Well, I guess it was in my case. We removed, when Houston became presiding judge, we removed the presiding judge for, we thought, legitimate reasons. In Houston, he wasn't the senior judge, but
who was the judge? If you don't mind, who was the judge you removed as presiding judge?
Judge Henry Todd.
Yeah. He was in Nashville.
Yeah, he was the presiding judge of the court, of the whole court.
Judge Todd was quite elderly when he finally was asked to step down.
He was.
And when he stepped down, then Judge Goddard became presiding judge.
Right.
What are the duties that a presiding judge has, not of the section, but the entire court? What duties do you have in addition to those that other judges have?
Trying to make sure that everybody gets an equal caseload and get their work out. And at our meetings, I conduct the meetings, and we have an agenda at each court meeting. We meet in the annual meeting of the court, and we meet in the spring and fall seminars. And you just try to stay on top of the things that are interest and need of the court. So it takes some extra time. Judge Gary Wade got the legislature to increase the salary of a presiding judge of the court $2,500 a year more. And, I won't name the judge, but a good friend of mine, I had a matter that was distasteful to deal with another judge, and I told this one judge, I said, I'll give you that salary for this month if you'll take over and do that for me. He said, I wouldn't do it on the bet. Most of the duties, I mean, we have a great court right now, and it's a very pleasant thing to work with.
Has it always been that way since you went on in '78?
No, no, but it is now. I think I think we have good judges and everything works well.
When it comes to oral argument in Knoxville, that's where you sit mainly, your section does. Do you, as presiding judge of the Eastern Section, do you assign the opinions, or how does that work?
My secretary assigns them, and she has no idea about the merits or dismerits of them, and there's a little story about that. I drew one of these water company cases, which has a big record and a lot of work, and
That's Chattanooga Water Company.
American Water Company.
Yeah.
I decided it, and my law clerk complained about it, my secretary complained about it. So on the heels of it, in another year, they brought another one. And the middle section, we were hearing them for the middle section for some other reason. I don't know why they should go to Nashville, but so I decided I knew my secretary probably wouldn't want to sign that case to me. So I told my 3 colleagues, I said, we'll just draw for this assignment. So we did, and I drew the damn case. They've had a lot of fun with me over that. They said, one of them said, this is the only way you're going to keep your job as presiding judge. You're an honest broker on assignments.
Let me ask this. The Court of Appeals was created in 1925.
Yes.
The Court of Criminal Appeals in 1967.
Right.
The Court of Appeals sits as grand divisions. You and 3 other judges in East Tennessee, 4 in Middle, 4 in West. On the
Correct.
Conversely, the Court of Criminal Appeals has the same number of judges, but it's an integrated court. And I remember when I was on the Court of Criminal Appeals, I might sit 1 month in Knoxville, 1 month in Jackson, and I would be.
But you're still part of the Eastern Section.
But we would be integrated. Do you know
Yeah.
historically how those differences occurred, or maybe not?
Well, you know, now, due to the budgetary problems, the Court of Criminal Appeals is not doing that as much. They have one person from outside the section to sit, but the whole court doesn't move anymore because of budgetary reasons. And we try to balance the workloads. So conversely, the Western Section and the Eastern Section go to Nashville some. Western Section more than the Eastern Section, but we go as well to balance the workload.
At one point in time, the Eastern Section had far more caseloads, or bigger caseload than the other 2. Now I understand it's the Middle Section that has the largest.
It is, and
do you know what the reason for that might be?
well, at some point, when we were getting all the cases, East Tennessee had 45% of the state's population and most of the industrial business, and they used to say East Tennesseans like to litigate and law each other. That was part of it. But now, there's a lot of business in the middle of the state, and the state has much more business in litigation. So the middle section, and the population is moved to the middle. I think more people live in the middle section than either the east or west now. The western section is much less than the eastern, but we're not the largest number of people in the East Tennessee now.
How often do you go to some other place besides Knoxville to hold court, and do you enjoy those times?
It's fine. I used to go to Jackson, but I haven't been in years. I go to Nashville about 3 times a year for 1 or 2 days.
Let me change subjects a little bit. You went on the Court of Appeals in 1978, and then in 1982 there was another election time for all the judges in the state, and at that time the Democratic Executive Committee, I think, selected the nominees for the Democratic candidates. Is that correct?
They did.
Tell us a little about how it worked back then, if you know about how the Democratic Executive Committee selected the candidates.
They would take applications from people that were interested, including the members of the court. They would have a hearing and allow them to make a presentation, and could ask them questions. And then they had an executive committee that conducted the hearings. And then they would cull out some, but recommend more than one for the given position to the full Democratic Executive Committee, and then the committee would nominate 5 for the Supreme Court.
Now, in 1982, if I'm remembering correctly, the Tennessee Supreme Court was not on a retention system.
It was not.
It was a typical partisan contested election.
Right.
And you're saying that the Democratic Executive Committee would nominate the 5 candidates for the
Correct.
Democratic nominees. So it wasn't a statewide primary.
No.
And what did the Republican Party do, if you recall?
I think they nominated them too without a primary.
Well, were you
Back in those days, it was almost a given that the Democrat nominee would be elected.
Yeah. And I think you expressed an interest in being one of the 5 Democratic nominees.
Well, that was in 1990.
1990.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how did it come about that you weren't one of the nominees, if you don't mind sharing that with
I
us?
withdrew before they. I addressed them and they said could be one of, if the party nominated me, I passed muster, but I withdrew before they voted on it. And Justice Cooper was in the race, and Riley Anderson, and me for one. When I withdrew, Riley ended up getting the nomination for the executive committee over Justice Cooper.
Okay. So Justice Cooper was denied a nomination then.
He was. So was Justice Harbison, and that's when Sissy Daughtry got the nomination.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you were in the game. How do you like that system now in hindsight, where the executive committee appoints nominees in a contested election? You like that system, or do you see problems?
I think it's much better to the system we've got. It's probably going to change, but they're screened. The governor gets to appoint, but they're vetted, and you don't have to raise money to get elected. And if you raise a lot of money, there's some kind of perception that you have some obligation to the people that gave you big bucks. I just don't think that's a good system to.
Now
I do think that the quality of the judiciary has improved with this system over the years.
You've been on the retention system since 1978.
Yes.
Have you ever raised any money to try to keep your seat?
No. I had some organized opposition to me in '06, but I didn't raise any money.
How did that happen, and what was it?
The legislature had passed a revised annexation statute in 1998, and I drew the first case that dealt with that, I guess, on appeal. And I followed the holding on that and allowed an annexation in Knoxville. And it was supposed to be a nonprofit, but they're dedicated to keeping cities from annexing territory. And when the election came along, they announced they didn't say they were opposing me, but they were going to educate the public about me. And they spent $30,000 or $40,000, mostly in radio ads and newspapers. Well, someone that had a good friend that was in the bad business, some people want to raise money for me, and I didn't want to do that. So my friend asked this person that's in the business and outlined what had happened, and they said, just don't do anything that they're not spending enough money to make a dent in the election, they didn't think, and they didn't. They might have lost me 10,000 votes total, but maybe not that much, who knows. I didn't raise any money or campaign or anything.
How do you go about selecting law clerks? At first, how many law clerks are you authorized to have?
2.
And how do you select them?
Well, I accept resumes from people who are interested in the job, and as I've been winding down, we now can have a senior law clerk, which you designate, and they make a little more money than the other one. So I've had the 2 I have now, one for 5 years and one for about 8.
Wow.
Since I'm winding down to retire, I just haven't been training new law clerks, and they were willing to stay with me, which, as you probably know, they're more benefit to you the longer they work than having to train them for a year and then lose them.
How do you use them? Do they write opinions? They write drafts? They write memos?
No.
What do you do?
I guess in one time in my career or two, maybe I've had my law clerk write an opinion. I have them do the research and study the record, and they give me a memorandum of law on the case, and I dictate the opinions. I use a lot of what they produce, obviously, but I organize my own opinion.
Yeah. Now, your office is here in Chattanooga in the state office building.
It is.
You're the only state judge in that building, aren't you?
Yes.
How do you still keep a sense of collegiality and comradeship with the other judges when you're down here by yourself?
Well, Judge McClarty for the last 3 years has been down here on my court, so we see each other. We pass orders and things back and forth, and
he's got nice civilian offices. You're still in the same state trial.
He does. Well, he looked in the state office building. They didn't have adequate space for him then, and the AOC said they could rent space down here cheaper than the state office building charge. So I'm proud for him that he got a nice office downtown. Well, we talk on the phone constantly. We exchange emails. So it's fax. I mean, it's about like being in the building with them if you need to talk to each other.
Well, I know enough about you to know that you're not the kind that is a lonesome character. You go out to lunch with people every day, the Mountain City Club or a group of friends. So
the lunch bunch of lawyers.
Yeah. Well,
that kind of keeps me up to date on what's going on at the bar.
You're known as an instigator. Why do you think people think of you as an instigator, stirring up practical jokes?
Well, they have to make that call themselves, but I think you're right. Some people think I am.
Would you think you are?
Sometimes I am.
Is it fun?
Yeah, more than I should, I guess.
Has anybody ever pulled some practical jokes with you as the victim?
Oh, yes. I was injured as a pedestrian in the 1980s, and as a teenager lost control of his vehicle, and he had limited insurance, and I told the adjuster, I said, I'm not going to hire a lawyer. He said, I'll settle with you for what coverage I've got. And I said, well, let's wait till I get a release from my doctor and see where I am. So I went to, before this happened, and I had several lawyers call and volunteer giving me legal advice about my case. We had a dinner meeting at the bar while this was going on, and some lawyers, after a few drinks, had come up to me and said, Judge, why did you hire an actual lawyer to represent you? Don't you think they're good lawyers here in Chattanooga? I came to find out one of my so-called friends would say, hey, did you know Franks has hired an actual lawyer to represent him in this personal injury case? So that was one that got turned on me.
That would have been Tom Williams.
You're right.
Let me ask this. You're talking and thinking about retiring. You've been a judge for 42 years. What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about going to law school today?
Well, you know, a fellow named Campbell used to be on public television. He's a philosopher. And he was always telling young people to follow their bliss and the rest of their life would come in place. I still believe that. If you really want to be a lawyer, you'll probably be a good one, and I think there's still room in the profession for you. The first time I ever thought about that, there was an old lawyer at Savannah who practiced law for 60 years, I guess, and so I go see him before I go to law school, and I said, talking to him about going to law school, and he said, and I said, you know, even back then they'd always said there were too many lawyers. Even this was in the 50s, and I said, that seems to be the case now. He said, son, don't worry about that. There's plenty of room at the top if you can get there. That was kind of inspirational. But no, I wouldn't advise anybody not to go to law school unless they really wanted to and felt something they wanted to do in life. Although I realize now there's not as many opportunities in the profession, perhaps, as there have been.
What advice could you give to a young lawyer about how to be professional and how to rise to the top? What advice could you give them?
Work hard, do a good job for your clients, be respectful of the courts, and stand up to them if they're wrong, and just be a good representative of your clients. And I think I'll take care of you.
That's good advice, Judge Franks. You've seen lawyers appear before you both as in your capacity as a trial judge and then as an appellate judge. Have you ever seen a lawyer who's a good trial lawyer but not very good on the appeal?
Probably, but I couldn't contrast it with anybody. But a good appellate lawyer, well, I remember Chancellor Finkelstein used to say, and at some point I guess I still would agree with this, he said if trial lawyers prepared their law at the trial level, there wouldn't be nearly as many appeals as you have. So trial lawyers are busy, and they sometimes don't think the legal theory through before they try the case, and then they try to take care of it on appeal. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm not being critical of them, because if you're a busy trial lawyer, you can't do everything you probably should do.
No. What else would you like to tell us today before we leave? How would you like to be remembered? Not that we're ready to bury you, but how would you like to be remembered?
Well, that I was dedicated to the law and tried to do a good job for the voters and the parties. I don't know what else I could say.
I think that's about as good as you can say. Let's take another little quick break. How often, or how far ahead do you set your oral argument schedule?
Well, 5 or 6 weeks.
So you can plan your schedule 5 or 6 weeks ahead?
Yes.
And just tell us typically in a month's time what your schedule would be. How much time you spend here? How often do you go to Knoxville?
Well, part of my time between those dockets is preparing the next docket and scheduling the cases and writing opinions. And I go to Knoxville and Babbage about once a month for court sessions.
And how long is that court session typically?
Typically it's 3 days. And the rest of the time is spent in my office here in Chattanooga working on, or if I go to Nashville sometimes too.
Now, one of your law clerks is stationed here and one in Knoxville.
One in Knoxville and one here.
How does that work out, having a...
It works very well to have one in Knoxville and one here.
I had one time in Knoxville for a year, and it worked out surprisingly well.
I didn't know it would when I started, but it sure has.
What do you think today of the quality of the written briefs? How do you think the quality today matches the quality it may have been in 1978? Have you seen it improve?
What?
Is the quality of the written briefs you get today the same as it was in 1978, or is it diminished, or has it improved?
It's improved some, I think. I think with the advent of the computer and research, and some of it, the computer has added some filler to it, even on opinion writing too. But yeah, by and large, I think you get more case authority from Tennessee and other states than we used to.
You know, one of the things that used to be of interest to lawyers is whether the appellate court hearing the case was what they called a hot court or a cold court. That is, have the judges read the briefs and have they become familiar with the case prior to oral argument, or do they go in and hear it for the first time and then read the briefs and become familiar?
Well, I can't speak for all of them, but the judges on my court, at least in the eastern section, we read the briefs before oral arguments, and it was something that in the record that we think is important, we don't know about, we can ask the clerk to check it for us. But yeah, by and large, you can say it's a hot court and that everybody on the panel has read the briefs before arguments.
Yeah. All right, let me change gears again, and let's talk a little bit about your judicial philosophy and some public policy. How has your judicial philosophy, if it has evolved, I guess it has, like everyone, evolved over the years? You think you've become more liberal, more conservative, more opinionated, more tolerant, more...
Probably more conservative. Not too much, but some, I think.
Yeah. Why?
Age and experience probably had something to do with it. when I first came on this court, I was accused of being a liberal. Maybe it's from Chester days. I don't know where they thought I got that representation, but I asked one of my local law clerks, I said, you think I'm liberal? He said, no. I said, some of the members of your court's so conservative, they think you're liberal. That was a law clerk's opinion.
Well, what do you think are some of the major challenges that are facing the judiciary today? Not just in Tennessee, but all around.
I think, well, I don't have criminal jurisdiction, but I think the criminal law is a major challenge on how we're going to deal with that. And we have half the prison population in the world in our prison here. We need to make some changes in the criminal law, and I regret that the United States Supreme Court is so divided and on their opinions. And the lower courts look to them for guidance, and I fear that they make some good decisions, don't get me wrong, but there's a perception that if you're in one group, you think this is justice, and you're another, you think this is justice, and that's a bad perception, I think, for the law.
How do you go about separating your own personal opinion about an issue and what you think the law requires?
Well, you hope you're conscious of your personal opinion, and if it clashes with what you think the law requires, you're supposed to set that aside and follow the law, or that's my idea about it.
What do you think about the significance of legal aid groups? You know, one of the emphasis now by our Tennessee Supreme Court is to increase pro bono representation among lawyer groups, and there has been a significant increase. Do you ever get any appeals that come from pro se litigants that you have to deal with?
Way too many, and it's increased. And it's not fun dealing with them. They may have a legitimate issue, but you probably will never realize it because they don't present a record that you can help them with. So that's the bad aspect of having to listen to those cases when you know there may be lurking something out there, a right that they're being denied, but they haven't been able to present it properly for us to do anything about it.
You know, under the Constitution, in a criminal case, the accused has a right to be represented by counsel, and if they can't afford counsel, then it's the obligation of the government to provide them with counsel. But not so in civil cases.
Right.
And of course, your court here is only civil cases. Do you think that somehow we need to provide counsel for indigents or for people who don't have representation in civil cases?
Well, it's a dilemma. You know, a lot of pro se cases are people that are disturbed and don't have any merit in the case. If there's somehow you could separate those from those that do, somehow or another we probably should have lawyers for some that don't have lawyers. But a little inside joke here, about sometime this spring, we had 5 pro se parties, 5 different cases with pro se parties on appeal, and it was a bad day at the OK Corral for the court.
Did they show up to argue their case?
Oh yes, but didn't help us any. It confused us, I guess. I get back in chambers and I say to my colleagues, I said, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to socialize the law and furnish them lawyers, and I didn't get any takers on that. I was being facetious in a way, but it's a real problem in society right now.
Well, it's a problem not only in the legal system, but in other systems. You know, one of the concerns that many people have is that our young folks today in their public schooling are not getting any instruction on civics. And it's amazing to me that people don't really even know the difference between the duties of the 3 branches of government. Do you have any feelings on that?
Well, yes, I agree with Sandra Day O'Connor. Justice O'Connor is retired. She's been preaching that we need to teach more civics and about government and its operation, and we certainly do. What's the old saying? If you ask the man on the street, should we repeal the Bill of Rights? And the majority would say, yeah, sure. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's out there. People are not aware too much about the function of the branches of government, and they get a lot of propaganda on TV that's not helpful either. And we're not learning in schools the basic structure of government and its duties and their responsibilities as well to their country.
Yeah, I'm jumping around a lot from topic to topic because we're nearing the end of our discussion, but you've spent a lot of time traveling back and forth between here and Knoxville. Has being away from your family had an impact on your family life, or not being able to do some of the things you would like to do?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, just with your regular court schedules, my wife says we have a job finding a time when we take a little vacation with always something going on with the court, but we manage.
I remember a couple of years ago I had the pleasure of interviewing Selma Cash Patey for one of these historical tapes, and I asked her, I said, when you began your practice here in 1949, I think you were the second female lawyer in Chattanooga, and she agreed, but now there are an abundance of women who are practicing law.
Half the law schools have half women students, I think.
What do you
we
think
have a
about women
Supreme
in the
Court with
profession?
3 women out of the 5 on it right now.
Yeah.
So they're making their mark.
Well, you know, when I was Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, there were at least 20 or 25 states around the country that had women chiefs. How many women were in your law school class at UT when you were there in the 50s?
3 or 4. And I regret to this day that we had a professor who taught domestic relations. His name was Martin Ferrick. He was a misogynist, and we had one girl in our class. She actually graduated, but she's nice. And he was way out of line with abusing her. And I thought, I'd been in the military, and I thought, I should just stand up and call his bluff, but he would have flunked me and kicked me out of class, and I didn't have the nerve as a student to do that. On hindsight, I wish I had. But she graduated, but I mean, he was really out of line. And tell you another story about my classmate, Hugh Garner, who's from Chattanooga. Hugh was a blocking back for the Sugar Bowl team in the 1950s. He was an undergraduate. Our first year in law school, we had legal bib under this Ferrick guy. And Hugh got the award, made the highest grade of the football team, I guess, and he got a trophy. Well, Ferrick had played professional ball for the New York Giants, but he hated athletes for some reason. The very next morning, he's in the Knoxville Journal about the award list. I'll never forget, we go in class, and he said, Mr. Garner, you got an award for having the best grades as a football player. Well, you can just scratch an F on that trophy because you're failing this course. He actually did that. Hugh had to take it again. I mean, we had some very good professors, but we had some real renegades as professors like him, a few, not many.
I think it's improved a lot since we were in law school.
Oh, I'm sure the faculty is so much better than it was. And we have better judges too. I think that's a real improvement in the last half a century in the courts and the professors in law school. More professional, better trained, better quality, I think.
Well, you've added to that.
Well, thank you for your compliment.
I think
I've struggled.
I think it's a good time for us to conclude. Thank you for being open, and thank you for your career.
I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for doing this as part of oral history.